So I'm Sarah. I'm just gonna dive right in. Today I'm gonna talk a little bit about burnout, specifically in our industry, what fuels it, and how we can use boundaries to overcome it. I like to introduce these conversations in a pretty simple, straightforward way. I like to do the straight to it. My name is Sarah, and I was a codependent caregiver. uh, this is an Alcoholic Anonymous, not Al-Anon, not Dare, but I do say it like that because that's the only familiarity I ever had with the concept of codependency. Codependency is like a really, really big, scary word. And I'm first to say, like I said, I didn't know anything about it outside of unhealthy relationships with drug and alcohol, maybe even abusive relationships. But I didn't realize that codependency had like severely stepped into my caregiving role, into my work, into my entire being. I didn't know that codependency is really just describing the energy exchange or the dynamic that we have with someone or something. It describes the relationship, the excessive need for approval, for worth, for identity, and it's the enmeshment and entanglement of our thoughts and our feelings. I never realized that we could be codependent with things that were good, that were altruistic, that were ultimately helpful, ultimately my sense of livelihood. um, I'd had grown codependent with caring in general, with helping, with being a caregiver. So when I talk about this, it's much less of a diagnosis or a strict label like I had considered it kind of to be prior, but more so as a description of the dynamic. And so for caregivers, we're far more susceptible to this codependent exchange slipping into our role. So we need to be really mindful of it. So a codependent dynamic organizes life around another person's problems and responsibilities, which is really slippery slope for us as caregivers, as nannies, because it's our job to be a caretaker. It's our job to be a caregiver. We're directly reinforced for that overextension, for that going above and beyond. And so it's natural that we start to attach that to our feeling of self-worth, attach it to our identity, to our feelings of safety. So like I said, I just proudly walked in all of my roles. I've been a caregiver. What started my role as a behavioral therapist, moved towards nannying, moved into respite providing. I poured my heart and soul into all of these roles. And that's to say that these situations, all of these roles, these jobs, were not bad in and of themselves. Obviously, we are wired for the love, for the connection, for the acceptance. We're chemically and biologically wired to live in this community in collaboration with each other to help. I feel good when I help other people. But when I started to become less Sarah and lost myself in the process, lost myself in the helping, it actually started to do massive disservice to those that I was caring for, and it eventually fueled my burnout. So the most important thing for us to continue caregiving sustainably and to caregive healthfully is for us to do it with boundaries that reflect our self-worth. We can absolutely do this work without losing ourselves. And we need nannies, parents, caregivers, just straight humans to be living rooted authentically in their own self-worth now more than we ever have ever before. So by prioritizing our self-care, by clarifying those boundaries and expectations, by mirroring that team perspective, we can start to shift the burnout paradigm and step back into fully aligned, meaningful work. So, little description of myself. My name is Sarah Carlisle Stuart. I like to say I'm a child caregiver gone coach because my heart ultimately is to empower caregivers of all kinds, to help you guys rediscover yourselves amidst sort of the inevitability of burnout, and you can get back to that meaningful impact with your families that is aligned in your self-worth, authenticity, and your integrity. So I got started in behavioral therapy. In that first year of early intervention, 3 of my direct supervisors had left the industry completely because they were burned out. And the turnover rate was so high that the original therapists that I had shadowed with were no longer there by the time I had officially started. And so when I started that, I was kind of told that burnout in the childcare industry, in the child caregiving industry in general, in child minding, was a given. It's inevitable. Everybody's going to burn out. Nannies burn out, teachers burn out, therapists burn out, parents burn out. So when I first got started, it was kind of like a warning of the inevitable. And I was told to kind of wait until it would hit. And I wasn't really given any tools to face it, let alone overcome it. I didn't really know that overcoming it was something that could happen other than quitting, like my supervisors and my coworkers had done. And so sitting in with that inevitability of burnout just didn't sit right with me, nor did the lack of education and resources available to me when I knew it was going to inevitably strike. So as we're having to make all sorts of decisions about our personal safety, about our education, about our childcare, burnout is really on the rise, even though it's not something all that new to us. And when we are under great stress, we revert and fall back on all of these automatic and learned responses. And for many of us caregivers, that's rooted in codependent patterns. So first, I'm going to explain to you what burnout is and what it looks like. So first and foremost, if you are burnt out, you are not alone. I'm sure you got into nannying because you love kiddos, you have a huge heart for family wellness, you became a parent with every intention to raise them full with love, you go in with all the best intentions, and then bam, burnout hits. So the definition of burnout is feeling emotionally, physically, mentally exhausted by over-the-top, excessive, or prolonged stress. So it can pop up when you're feeling overwhelmed by the long list of things to do, like analysis paralysis, when you lose the emotional capacity to keep helping, to keep supporting others. So it looks like compassion fatigue, building resentments, building that cynical outlook. Can look like a constant looming stress, a road straight to exhaustion, like you've jumped full force into your caregiving, into your nannying, into your parenthood, that you've run yourself out so that there is no other you. It's just that caretaker. And so burnout can make us feel dread going to work, can make us feel dread getting up in the morning, going towards the crib, going towards the bedroom, because it is all that compiled, exhausted state, piled on stress. And so because burnout is all so gradual and it's all of these habits that we're building over time, the signs and symptoms can kind of creep up on us really quick. So I've kind of labeled out varying stages of where we get to burnout, because it's kind of, like I said, the only mention of burnout to me was at my initial onboarding, and it was just a warning of the inevitable. And I think a big part of burnout is we're not really sure how we got there, and we're just like, boom, it hit us. So I've affectionately termed this the 7 deadly steps to burnout, like the 7 deadly sins. So we can start to identify like what's going on, start to give names to what's happening, and break down that taboo nature of it. So number one, and where it all starts, is the compulsion to prove our worth, where we find our self-worth, where we find our self-esteem. That's why it's really easy for us caregivers to slip into this, because we dive full force into number one. We feel good, we get rewarded for helping others, for doing good things, for solving problems, gaining their approval. And like I said, and I'm always gonna keep repeating, it isn't a bad thing to help, but it is a slippery slope when that becomes our root. And if that happens, check into number 2. Are you neglecting your own needs? Are you putting your needs last, if ever getting to them at all? I know that I've had just straight crumbs for lunch, or don't drink water until I'm like right before bed. Or you need the extra sleep, you really want to make it to the farmer's market, but you say yes to extra hours, extra duties, even though it's affecting your overall wellness. Are you putting your needs last? Where are they on your priority list? Which leads to number 3, a displacement of conflicts. If you know that you are not meeting a need that you have, you're displacing a need, are you then displacing that conflict? You may feel guilty for taking time off, may feel guilty for asking for a break, asking for a few minutes alone, may have even received backlash for expressing conflicts. And so then you start to take it internally, personally, and ignore them, repress them, and then build a harboring of resentment, which then eventually leads us to a rich vision of our values, where we start to act outside of our integrity. And that sounds really, really serious, but it's not as serious as like stealing from the job, but it's more subtle, like shameful, self-critical, perfectionistic tendencies. Like when I would wait for my bosses to get home and then conveniently look busy when they would walk in, or wanting to make sure I was down on the floor playing when they walked in. It further emphasized where I was rooting in step one, where I was finding my self-worth. But it was exacerbated by all of these self-sabotaging, self-limiting habits that were holding me back. Because burnout ultimately makes you behave in ways that are foreign to you. They're not your authentic self, and they can make you feel completely lost from yourself in that day-to-day. That eventually leads us to a denial of problems, possibly even unable to see them, let alone communicate what those are. Withdrawal and depersonalization, because you start to think, who could ever feel this way? Start to feel overly responsible for the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others, losing yourself in the process, isolating, pulling away from community, pulling away from support, which is really tough for us when we are the only person on the job. We don't have those coworkers. So that isolation, that depersonalization gets further and further removed. And then the big shebang, we hit burnout. So ultimately, it's this sort of attachment to our worth and this fear that keeps us from shining a light on this. And I think it's because we've kept it so under wraps that we don't really know what it looks like, how it manifests. We start to feel really guilty, like how could I simultaneously love what I do, love being a caregiver, a nanny, a mom, but feel empty, unfulfilled, useless at the end of the day? How could I be largely empathetic, but also feel completely drained and discouraged by the same people that I care for? So for nannies and caregivers, we oftentimes overextend, even though saying no, setting those boundaries would save us from the burnout, because burnout for us is often fueled by those codependent dynamics, in dynamics where you find your worth, like a nanny, like your job, like a mom, like a helper. So when we say no to others, when we set those boundaries, it kind of feels like we're admitting failure, like we're shedding a part of our identity. And then in this way, burnout kind of creates this existential crisis for us. So if we're not intentional or careful with our caregiving, we quickly see that shadow side of empathy. We allow ourselves to become attached to these vampiric, codependent dynamics that take from us more than they give to us. So even though I had been warned, even though I understood that burnout was going to be inevitable, I didn't really know what to look out for. I didn't know how to stop that avalanche once it started. We aren't really taught how to operate any differently. We're not really taught to set those personal boundaries, set up realistic expectations, or communicate in ways that align with those values and your integrity. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into what that codependency means, because codependency just merely describes the dynamics you have with someone or something. And like I said before, I never realized that I could be codependent with good things, with altruistic things, with helpful things. And that's especially true for us as caregivers. And I just want to put a little side note. I try not to define that caregiver because I think it really applies to so many of us that are helpers by nature. Some of us are moms, some of us are nannies, some of us are Enneagram 2s, teachers, dads, uncles. At the root of it all, we're caregivers. Because we invest so much of our time and energy into caring for others, our sense of self can start to feel separate from us. So we become dependent on that caregiving, dependent on others to give us our sense of self-worth and self-esteem. So several ways codependent dynamics show up for us are like an unhealthy focus, an unhealthy responsibility on their thoughts, problems, feelings, oversharing our personal information or providing unsolicited advice to gain worth or trust or approval, hiding your feelings, holding on to unspoken resentments, overextending, saying yes, for fear of conflict, for fear of rejection, having those shameful, self-critical, perfectionistic tendencies that compromise your values and integrity. And so like, I want to get to that root of it, is that the biggest sign of our self-worth being rooted in the compulsion to please or to gain the approval of those we care for. And ultimately that's because our boundaries aren't clear. The pattern I typically see is overextending because of unclear boundaries, feeling obligated to do it continually, guilt that you've developed these hard to break, self-sabotaging habits that just ultimately feed that narrative of unworthiness, feeling you're not worth even setting the boundaries. So then nannies start to deprioritize self-care, feels meaningless, it feels self-indulgent. It just is all burnout, all isolation, feeling that lack of community, that lack of support. Ultimately, the time of those antiquated systems that led to burnout is over. It's not healthy, it's not sustainable, and it doesn't have to be that way. Remember that burnout is caused by prolonged stress, and stress causes us to fall back and revert to old habits, rhythms, and patterns. So, in order for us to be caregivers rooted in our self-worth, we have to change those habits and patterns that we carry on. So healthy caregiving rooted in your self-worth, instead looks like a healthy distinction between which problems are yours to solve and which are those of those you care for. It honors your personal space, and you share that information based on gradual building of trust. It looks like actively practicing self-care. It looks like recognizing that your love cup needs to be overflowing to sustainably pour from it. It looks like preventing that overextending with clear boundaries and expectations. Ultimately, it is possible for us to step powerfully into our roles, into our healing presences, and also walk in our authenticity and integrity. And that looks like creating and clarifying our boundaries that are sustainable for us, sustainable for our families, sustainable for career longevity, and then overall wellness, so that we are truly authentic, acting in our integrity and with healthy collaboration. What if instead of working yourself to the bone, you could follow simple methods from going from burnout to boundary boss? What if you could actually make the most meaningful impact on your family while upholding your values and authentic self? What would that mean for you and your job? What would that mean for your role as a parent? If we continue to embody and practice caregiving rooted in codependency, rooted in a codependent exchange, burnout will remain inevitable and it will continue to be the norm. When we operate from a codependent place, operate from a place eager to please, operate from a place centered on likability, then we're no longer acting as ourselves in our authenticity or in our integrity, which is ultimately what we were hired to do, or what you hired someone else to do, or what you intended for your parenthood or for your nannyhood. When we step outside of our authenticity and operate from that codependent need to please place, we're doing a tremendous disservice to our families. Just like with our kiddos, our behaviors are always communicating something. If we constantly get our worth cup filled by helping others, which is inherently taking from our cup, that puts us in a codependent dynamic where we need to keep caregiving in order to keep going. So it's cyclical. In that way, we engage in behaviors that support that pattern. We give too much of ourselves, leading to compassion fatigue. So our behaviors communicate that we need to feel worthy. I need to feel good about who I am, and I get that from giving to others. So we see crisis, rush to help, it feels good, and then that cycle just continues. It's important to remember that helping, caregiving isn't wrong. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, that's what we're called to do. That's why it feels good. But the most fundamentally important thing in our caregiving is to be rooted in our sense of worth, because operating from that place fundamentally changes the equation. When we shift this perspective, when we shift our approach, we create more opportunities for that impact, more opportunities for us to be expansive in this industry, for our families, for us to live authentically. So in the past, instead of changing what this paradigm looked like, We've been asking caregivers to kind of change themselves to kind of fit into this weird mold. But if I was hired because of my authenticity, hired because of who I am, but am actually incapable of truly acting authentically and with integrity because of the nature of that dynamic, where does that leave us? If what we value is authenticity in raising our children, a role we were hired for, a role many of us chose, authenticity is really the only way. And in order to be authentic, and we need to know what we value and communicate those through boundaries and expectations, and then embrace collaboration and cohesion as a team from that point. If you don't feel worthy of your self-care, worthy of the self-love, which I didn't for a very, very long time, you're going to continue to buy into the self-limiting beliefs, continue to believe the nagging voice of your critical companion, and that's going to hold you back from truly living in your authenticity as a caregiver. When you start to recognize this energy exchange, start to recognize what's actually filling your cup, you start to recognize that self-care goes so much deeper than just caring for our physical and emotional selves. It goes so much deeper down to our inner narratives of our worth, embodying the same compassion that we show to those that we care for. It's really, really important that we recognize the energetic role we have in the home. As nannies and caregivers, we typically enter into energies that are already at play, like kiddo threw a tantrum 10 minutes before you came in, mom had a hard time putting Bobby to sleep last night, breakfast is running late, so everybody's hungry. Oftentimes we feel those dynamics before we even know what to do about them. We're professionals at hitting the ground running and anticipating the needs of others. But because of this, these instincts may cause you to tiptoe, to make yourself smaller, to try not to trigger others, may cause you to people please or act foreign for approval, trying to counterbalance the thoughts and feelings of others, trying to make them feel comfortable no matter the cost to your own well-being. So because we're oftentimes hired out of this necessity, it kind of feels like we're in a time of triage, like we're ticking boxes, trying to get, it's an emergency, we're trying to get to the next day. And so because of that, we build on that energy and start to think that everything is urgent, everything is emergent, and that in and of itself creates that excessive, prolonged stress. And it's just a cycle that we keep going through. Our kiddos are going to remember most how we respond to this, how we act in our self-care, how we make habits that are intentional and not instinctual, how we make habits that are rooted in our self-worth, rooted in our values, and then are not ultimately depleting of us. It is really important that we start to ensure that our cups, and that means our worth cup, are overflowing to be able to pour from it sustainably. We need to start putting our hypothetical oxygen masks first. And the best thing we can do for our families is to be on our own sides. That's why I explain that burnout for a helper or a caregiver is oftentimes fueled by this codependency, because if we don't address the source, we don't truly fix the smoldering of the burnout. In the codependent dynamic, we get our cup filled, we get our worth and esteem cup filled. All of our caring is rooted in I am good or I am worthy because of or when I care for others. I exist for this job, for parenthood, for else, for other. All of that is rooted in codependent dynamics. And it's really easy for us to interpret the filling cup metaphor as needing to show up at 100%. But it's less so about making sure you're able to show up 100%, because we can't, that's an illusion. But it's knowing that you own 100% of your cup and those that you care for own 100% of their cup, so that we're not over spilling cups, enmeshing and entangling those stress cycles. When we start to understand the root or the reasons for our behaviors or patterns, where we're operating from, then we can start to make those shifts and pivot so that we're no longer acting outside of ourselves. This actually starts to heal the dynamic because it ultimately builds more trust, more transparency, and more vulnerability. There's more opportunity for growth, meaningful impact, and more confidence in our ability to care for our families when we are stepping into our worth fully. When I am really in a rut, when I'm in the midst of my burnout, self-care is the farthest thing from my priority. I often catch myself falling back on the "there's nobody to cover for me" excuse. There's only one of me. I know nannies, caregivers, moms, dads, they feel that too. Like, there's just one of me. I can only do so much. And because there's only one of us, there's no option for self-care. It becomes last priority. I will use it as an excuse to fall out of my self-care habits instead of using it to make self-care. There's a special pathway to self-care when we recognize that it's not only important for us to practice self-care, but it is a vital example to show our kiddos. When you're a helper, it's easy to brush off our own self-care because it makes us feel like we can actually care more. If I spend less time in the bathtub, then I have more time to spend more time reading books to Timmy. But it's actually a huge disservice when we're operating at half full. You may not be able to take a day off as a nanny, as a mom, as a dad, but you can model the self-care, the self-worth on the job, especially on the job. Our kiddos need to see our self-care as much as we need to practice it. It's so easy for us to keep going despite being tired, despite being hungry, afraid. Like I said, I'm the first to admit I'll go a full day forgetting to feed myself, living solely on caffeine. Recognizing it or not, those are the ways I'm neglecting my self-care and neglecting my self-worth. When we use this old narrative, this old pattern, we buy into the self-limiting beliefs that we're unworthy of communicating our needs, unworthy of our own livelihood, that our sole purpose was in service of others. But this leads us down a path of martyrdom and a total false sense of humility. Caring isn't the problem, that we're helpers isn't the problem, but the mindset that we're operating from. When I buy into the self-limiting belief that I can't get any self-care and I operate from that place, I fulfill that with the self-sabotaging habits, like overextending beyond what I'm comfortable with, putting myself in compromising situations because I fear speaking up, neglecting and suppressing my own feelings, engaging in those codependent dynamics. So ultimately, it's important for your longevity and for the wellness of your family when everybody's authenticity is honored and celebrated. The second component to healing the burnout dynamic is clarifying and setting boundaries and expectations that are aligned with the values and your worth. It might seem like a really silly reminder, but you don't need to give every minute, every thought, every feeling of every day to those you care for to be a good caregiver. You don't need to care too much to be a good caregiver. In fact, caring too much that we lose ourselves and our sense of purpose is that tremendous disservice to our loved ones. As we've sprinted to aid our families, sprinted to harmonize, sprinted to balance out the energies, the tough feelings, the overwhelm, we develop that compassion fatigue, that caring too much. When you're invested so wholeheartedly in caring, when it's your existence and your entire being, it's very easy to fall into the burnout trap. This is something that was all too familiar to us before COVID. And now that we are experiencing levels and severities of trauma, individual and collective, we really have to take a look at what these paradigms are. The thing is, you probably never cared about being a good caregiver, but instead giving the most impactful care to your family as they navigate their life. Instead of giving everything into caring too much, recognize that boundaries will provide the landscape for truly meaningful care so we can keep doing it and keep doing it well. Boundaries like codependency can sound really scary, especially when the context we know it in is generally negative. Like with codependency and my familiarity only being with drugs and alcohol, the glasses through which I looked at boundaries was also negative. So I kind of just threw them aside. There was no way they were relevant to me. Boundaries in our current paradigm make us really uncomfortable. We may start asking, can I be a good person? Can I be helpful and still set boundaries? Why do boundaries make me feel guilty? Are boundaries harsh, selfish, or mean? In our current system, in the current dynamics we're operating under, we're usually only setting hard boundaries. Setting boundaries in situations that are confrontational, that are uncomfortable, Something happened, so you set the boundary. We approach boundaries as hard walls that say, stay out. But boundaries ultimately are not the walls. If you imagine yourself like a house, boundaries aren't the walls, but instead they tell people where the front door is, how to enter appropriately, how to enter respectfully. It explains what the dynamic, what the rules of the relationship, what the responsibilities of the relationship are. If people enter your house crashing through the glass windows, tearing down your curtains, tracking mud through your carpeted room, people enter through the back door unannounced, demolishing it down so then the door becomes unusable. People drive right through your walls, taking it down, hurting the infrastructure of the house. This is all why boundaries are so important. They tell people how to enter the house sustainably and healthily for everyone, so they don't get hurt along the way, misinterpreting my beautiful stone garden for a walking path, so they don't think the open window is an invitation to jump in that way. The importance of clarifying our boundaries up front and with honesty and ongoing for the relationship is ultimately in our favor. I really suggest all nannies, all families start normalizing transparent conversations about growth. Begin normalizing that growth mindset, treating situations as learning opportunities, normalizing perspective shifts. Normalize boundary setting outside of stressful confrontational situations, outside of parameters where they do mean walls and barriers. Start normalizing that team mindset, that team collaboration, ensuring that we're all on the same page, working for the same goals. Normalizing these team conversations not as ways to criticize or condemn, but with intention of seeing what the needs are and adjusting from that point. Boundaries teach the other party, the other half of the dynamic, where the responsibility of one party ends and the responsibility of the other begins. Boundaries teach people how to approach you with the most sustainability for your dynamic, for the infrastructure of your house. Boundaries in and of themselves are for relationship, are for collaboration, for building, and for growth. They don't need to be scary or confrontational. Instead, we can start to use that clarification of expectations so that everybody is on the same page. When we set boundaries that are reflective of our self-worth, reflective of our self-care, then we are directly in service of us to embrace a team and growth mindset for our families. For a small little exercise to stir up thoughts about what you value, what serves you, I suggest nannies, parents, families to sit down and in this, be mindful and intentional about the culture of your family, kind of like a Bill of Rights or like a manifesto. What are your values and what does your family prioritize? What does your family want to nurture and grow? From there, you can begin to set your goals and habits that support that and be incorporated into your methodology, your actions, and the way you operate as a family. The nature of our roles as caregivers, as parents, as nannies, like I mentioned, we're professionals at hitting the ground running, the best at living in the moment. And that way we start to look at our jobs a little bit differently. There's a learning curve as we start to get to know our families, our kids, builds that rapport. But that piece of onboarding is such an important component for setting expectations for both parties. Clarifying what's expected. When you do that, everybody is able to show up with confidence. There's so much less room for second guessing, so much less icky feelings of being left confused from miscommunication. And that's really especially true when we're navigating unclear waters. As empaths, as caregivers, as parents, we are the mirror for many of the projected feelings and energies of those we care for. Nannies act as a mirror for parents, parents act as a mirror for nannies. You're a caregiver, naturally empathetic, intuitive, a helper, maybe a people pleaser, like I talked about, but you're not a punching bag. Oftentimes as caregivers, if we've bought into the self-limiting beliefs that we're less than or merely there as the help or at my lowest, maybe I do get paid to be a punching bag. But that story, that narrative, that dynamic no longer serves us. It actually never did. It prevented us from truly showing up for our families with impact. Instead, this is an opportunity for us to reset the expectations, shifting the mindset, starting with us. I've seen many of us experience and seeing mom guilt at extreme levels. So I've been telling nannies, because we are the mirror in the home, we're going to be on that receiving end sometimes. It isn't always reflective of us, but it does affect the energy of the day-to-day, does affect the dynamic, does affect the opportunities for true meaningful impact. So we can start to use even that as an opportunity to actually turn up the volume in our caregiving, in our parenthood, and in our nannying. It doesn't have to take a long route to our self-worth, but it does require stepping up for yourself with powerful mindset shifts that dismantle those self-sabotaging habits that truly embrace the team mindset. So I've received questions. I like to go into this specifically about mom guilt and stuff because I received questions like, how do I approach my mom boss defensive that kiddo sleeps for me, but not for her? Or how do I share my knowledge and expertise without condemning her, making her feel like I'm not on her side? And I always applaud these questions because it illuminates the intention of the team mindset. Nannying, caregiving is lovely because it can be super intentional, but it can also feel really overwhelming and unguided when we don't root in our self-worth and start from that place. When we operate in a codependent dynamic, it can look like mom working from home, but finding her worth and existence in being a mother. Nanny comes in, kiddo's super excited to see her. And so mom feels a little hurt, gives nanny a to-do list so she feels less passive, feels more involved. But then that kind of makes nanny feel unseen, feels condemned, like, don't I do this every day? So then that's just a codependent dynamic that we are going back in that cycle. When we operate in the codependent dynamic, our triggers, our personal triggers, are going to highlight self-limiting beliefs that we've held on to. Like, I'm not a good mom, or I'm not worthy, I'm not a worthy nanny, I'm a bad nanny. All the lies we bought into and absorbed about our worth based on how we show up through cultures, movies, shows. We absorb all of these ideas about motherhood, parenthood, nannyinghood. When we receive criticism, when we receive some sort of, you should do this, it's really all of those self-limiting beliefs that are coming up. We become accustomed to defining ourselves by our belief sets, by our roles, by our ideologies. We start to take all of that on top of our limiting beliefs and start to engage in ways that are self-sabotaging and preserve the idea that we're less than, that we're unworthy, that we're bad. It can start to feel like our essence, our being is being criticized, and then we jump without recognizing to the defense and start operating from that place. Instead, when we stop, identify where the feelings are, readjust, and pivot the mindset, we can go forward. The very personal nature of our job is kind of a codependent playground, but it's so much easier to see the codependent bait when you're captivated by your own purpose and rooted in your own self-worth. When we approach all of these things as opportunities to grow, that is when our work becomes fruitful. We are the mirror in the home of the families we serve. When we receive these, we have the opportunity to reflect back the love, the worth, the intentionality. Let's reset expectations, set boundaries, and emulate a loving and healing response. This is such a powerful way to embrace and embody the team mindset, because when we're not taking on the feelings and actions of others, but instead we're walking through them with them. That way, when things do happen, like little Bobby doesn't sleep for mom, we are still confident in our worth, still strong in our values and boundaries, and can bring out our step-by-steps in non-confrontational, collaborative ways. That way, let's say Bobby doesn't sleep for mom and we see it's just because I give Bobby a snack now before and mom doesn't, we can now kind of see that as a problem and approach it from a team mindset, not as confrontational or reflective of our worth. It's just something that works for Bobby. We're able to recenter and return back to the intention of it all, a happy and healthy kiddo, happy, healthy family. And so in the end, as I wrap this up, I want to kind of return this. This is kind of just an opening of a conversation. I think all too frequently, especially when we're operating from a place tied to that codependent dynamic, we're afraid to ask for help, to candidly, to transparently talk about those things that we're going through. When we receive our worth from that caregiving, we might feel like a failure by admitting when we need the help. But I call this a conversation to remind us what we were all called to emulate, which is that it takes a village to raise our families, to raise ourselves, to live in commune and in community. In order to make a shift in the burnout paradigm, we also need to shift our focus to celebrate all of us caregivers in our fullest authenticity. And that is what I have.